In this video, I want to convince you that writing and speaking are two of the most powerful tools that humans have to adapt, survive, and thrive in the world. And I'm going to prove that to you using fighter jets. During the Korean War, two main fighter jets were used, the MiG-15 on the one hand and the F86 Sabre on the other. Now, as you look at these two planes, you might notice that they look very similar. In fact, they're almost identical in every way. Consequently, you might expect that they would perform roughly equally well against each other. But if you expected that, you'd be wrong. In fact, the F86 Sabre had a 15-to-1 kill ratio over the MiG-15. So the question is, why? John Boyd, who was a fighter pilot, a flight instructor, and a military theorist, thought that he had the answer. And by the way, if you don't know anything about John Boyd, I've linked to his obituary in the description below. He led one of the craziest, most adventurous lives ever. Highly recommend you go check it out. Anyway, back to the two airplanes. Here's what John Boyd thought. Even though these two airplanes were virtually identical, the F-86 had two hidden advantages in its design. First, better cockpit visibility. The pilot of the F-86 actually sat just a little bit higher in the cockpit than the pilot of the MiG-15. Additionally, the F-86 had a bubble canopy, unlike the MiG-15, which had some struts built into the cockpit that could potentially obstruct the view. So the F-86 pilot is sitting a little bit higher up and can see more clearly through the bubble cockpit. In other words, the pilot of the F-86 can pull in information from the environment faster, and it's more likely to be accurate information as well. Second, power steering. The F-86 had a hydraulic flight control system instead of a manual flight control system. Basically, this is the equivalent of power steering in your car. Rather than having to crank the wheel using only your strength, there's a mechanical system inside that amplifies your strength. What this effectively meant is that not only was the pilot of the F-86 able to pull in more information better and faster from the environment, but he was also able to respond to that information faster and better and for a longer period of time. These two abilities, to pull in information faster and implement decisions based upon that information faster, these two things John Boyd believed made the F-86 dominant over the MiG-15. Boyd later developed a whole theory of strategy based on these observations called the OODA Loop. OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. Observing is taking in new information. Orienting is creating a mental map that consolidates that information into a meaningful framework. Then deciding is using that framework to figure out what to do next, and then acting is actually implementing that decision, OODA. Now, according to John Boyd, this cycle was the fundamental grammar of all strategic combat, not just in the air, but everywhere. In fact, he believed that it was the fundamental grammar of all kinds of purposeful human action. All of it. So, what does this have to do with writing? Well, I'll tell you. John Boyd actually believed that the most important step in the OODA Loop was the orienting phase, and it's not hard to see why. If you touch a stove and draw back your hand out of reflex, then you have observed, you have pulled in data from the outside world, and you've also acted. But the sophistication and complexity of that decision is pretty small. In order to act in a sophisticated and complex way, you need to move through that orienting phase. That orienting phase is a lot like creating a mental map of the world around you. For instance, if you were lost in the desert, you might look up and notice that the sun is coming up over there, in which case you know that that's east and that's west. You've created a model that helps tell you which direction is which, and therefore helps you know where to go and what to do next. Of course, if you had an actual map of the terrain, that would be even better. Then you could take that abstract representation, look at the world around you and say, I need to walk in that direction for 3 hours, and then I will find a city and water. Basically, that orienting phase, the creation of mental maps and models, the creation of symbolic abstract representations of the world, makes it so that we can engage in more sophisticated and more complex ways of acting. In fact, although you haven't noticed it, you're using mental maps all the time, every day. If you cook with a recipe, you're using a mental map, that recipe, in order to project into the future what should happen next. If you've ever watched a movie, then you've watched an abstract visual representation of a potential scenario that could play out, even though historically it didn't really happen. In fact, if you've just ever sat around daydreaming, you might notice that you start thinking about possible futures that you want to move towards, and also possible futures that you are trying to avoid. In other words, you're creating mental maps and saying, if I engage in these behaviors, then this is the future that could result, and if I engage in these less desirable, more harmful behaviors, then I'm going to end up in this bad future that I want to avoid, so I won't engage in those behaviors. So you can see why John Boyd thought that orienting was the most important step in this OODA loop. This creation of mental maps and models is incredibly powerful. Now, humans have a lot of different ways of creating these mental maps, a lot of different ways of creating symbolic representations. For instance, we have sculpture. You can create a representation of a human or some other object. We also have visual art. We also have, for example, theater, right? You can actually act out a drama and see what happens. But I think you could make a really good case that language is the single most powerful system of symbolic representation that we have. I think it's totally unparalleled for the diversity of ideas that it can represent, the clarity with which it can present those ideas and things, and also its sheer ubiquity. For instance, right now I'm using language to communicate to you. So let's put the puzzle pieces together. Writing is one of the most, if not the most, powerful symbolic system that we have to create mental maps of the world. And we absolutely need mental maps in order to figure out what to do in any kind of sophisticated or complex way. What that ends up meaning is that writing and speaking are one of, if not the most powerful tools that we have to navigate the world. And this is also justification for why every college freshman has to take a writing course. We don't write just because it's an arbitrary requirement. We don't write just because it's part of our cultural tradition. And we don't write just because it's fun or beautiful, although it certainly can be those. We write and speak because there's no difference between doing those things and thinking. And if you can't think, you can't act. On the other hand, if you can write and speak, and if you can do it clearly and precisely, then you can think. And you can act in sophisticated and complex ways. And if you can do that, you can adapt and survive and thrive in the world. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that it was thought-provoking. In the space below this video, YouTube actually has a special designated location where you can put your own symbolic representational maps of the world to help us all figure out what to do next. That's the comments section, by the way. If you do want to leave something there, we'd sure appreciate it. We'd also sure appreciate the like and subscribe. Thanks. We'll see you next time.